We are live. Welcome, welcome, welcome. One more welcome for the East Coast, one more welcome for the West Coast. Part of our continuing series where we talk to reporters, writers, activists, professors, anybody on the left, anybody on the right, and we want to provide their perspective on political polarization to you, unedited and unfiltered, so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back. Maybe it never will. With us today, it is our privilege to have Professor William Schreckhise. I hope I said that correctly. He's the Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences Department of Political Science at the University of Arkansas. He was at Washington State University in 1991. 1994, 1999. He's an associate professor and the chair of the Department of Political Science. He teaches and researches in the areas of American politics, public policy, law, administrative law, and public administration. He is the author of Evaluating American Democracy and Public Policymaking, which assesses the abilities of American political system to make public policy. His work has appeared in the Journal of Public Administration, Research and Theory, Administration and Society, Social Science Quarterly, State and Local Government Review, and Youth and Society. He's the recipient of the Fulbright College Master Teacher Award in 2014 and Outstanding Advisor in 2017. Some of the works that he's worked on is Evaluating American Democracy, Decision-Making in the Hidden Judiciary, Independence in Administrative Adjudications, and Administrative Law Judges Agency Adjudication. PhD in Political Science from Washington State University, a Master's in Political Science also from Washington State, and then a BA in Political Science also from Washington State. Previous employment, Chair and Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, University of Arkansas. He was an Associate Professor and Director of Legal Studies before that. He's also an Associate Professor of Political Science there at Arkansas. Another one, and faculty advisor for the Fulbright College Advising Center, and then a visiting instructor for the Department of Political Science, University of Arkansas. He also held this podcast, To Respectfully Disagree. He's an expert on political polarization and incivility, and this is the book where he found him. And we've already talked to a couple people about this, but we will also talk to this professor. But before we get to that, let's check in and see how well we did. Professor, did I say anything wrong? Did I get anything incorrect? And I need to correct that.
I will give you kudos for pronouncing my last name correctly. Very well done. Not everybody can do that. I'm actually a professor, no longer an associate professor. For those of you who know, it's a bit of a promotion to go from one to the other. I think that's just an outdated resume that you had there, but I'm very happy to be here.
My father was a translator in NATO for the German army and the American army, so he taught us a little German. So a little bit of that.
Well, it served you very well today. Thank you, your father.
Well, I know you're a busy man. Thank you for coming out. We'll get right to the meat and potatoes. A lot of our audience has already seen this book. We've talked to other people, but we want to hear it from as many people as possible and from your perspective, unedited. A, is political polarization bad in America? And B, how does this book shed light on that?
Well, political polarization is a fact of life. Not everybody's going to agree. James Madison said it best back in Federalist Number 10, just humans are just by nature people who have different opinions. So that's not so much the problem. What we've seen in the last 30 years is an increasing divergence ideologically between Republicans and Democrats. We know this because we've got really good measures of ideology of people who serve in Congress. And I'm sure you've seen the graphs where you just show the difference, where you can see the difference in how members of Congress vote from the two parties just diverging significantly. There's no longer that core moderate middle that served us so well during like the civil rights era, right? What we're focusing on in the book and what a lot of my recent research is focused on isn't so much on the polarization per se, but instead incivility, which can but does not have to be a product of political polarization. And by that, I mean, when we talk about incivility, we're just talking about how people treat each other. And If you've been
Right.
online at all for the last 10 years, you know that online discussions can get pretty intense, especially when they involve politics. As a result, our Thanksgiving dinner discussions with our relatives have grown a bit more intense. What we focus on in the book is how people in government treat each other. And in particular, we're looking at how state legislators treat each other and examining whether or not those things can be discoverable in a way that gives us some an indication of the pattern. So what we're able to do is figure out which state legislators in which state legislatures treat each other the best and which states the opposite is occurring. So we find states like Utah, because it's Utah and everybody's nice in Utah, apparently, the legislators get along really, really well. And they are rated as being very, very civil. And in other states like, say, Oklahoma and Oregon, they're not getting along so well. And so we try to figure out what can account for this. Why some states like Utah, you're seeing people getting along well, and other states not so much. So we spend quite a bit of time in the book talking about this.
What are the so has incivility gotten worse over the last couple of years, or in your research did you find it's always been bad the last 20 years and we haven't seen anything like a peak or a rise ever since 2016 at all? Or did you find a growth in incivility that's alarming and has occurred mostly in the last few years?
Well, so in the book, what we have is it's called cross-sectional data. So we don't have data that could show us any trends across time, because the way we determine whether or not state legislatures are civil or not is by surveying lobbyists. We did a national 50-state survey of lobbyists who are registered with the state, and we asked them a whole bunch of questions. The survey is actually quite extensive. It's about 30 minutes to complete. But in that survey, there were specific questions asking the lobbyists to rate how civil they thought the legislators treated each other. And this data comes from 2018. The survey actually started in 2018, but we didn't finish until 2019. So we're not able to make any comparisons across time. We're actually in the process of collecting a second wave of data for this year. And so when that data come in, which it hasn't yet, it'll come in the next few months, we'll be able to say that incivility is growing. And even better, we'll be able to talk about where it's grown worse, where it's grown better, and then explore why. But with the cross-sectional data, we were able to come up with some pretty interesting conclusions just focusing on the comparisons among the 50 states. So one thing that we actually found is that intense party competition in states where, a lot of states today, you've got what's called the trifecta, where, all three elected branches of government, the House, the Senate, and the governor, are all the same party. You would assume in those single party dominant states where, say, the Republicans have the trifecta, everybody's getting along really well. And it's in the other more competitive states like, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, whatever, where the competition is a little more fierce, that they're not getting along. But that's not the case, actually. And it depends on how you run the models. And this is sort of a bit of an inconclusive finding. But in some instances, the data actually show that the states where competition between the parties is the fiercest, that's where you see the legislators getting along the most, the best. So like in Washington State had a pretty evenly divided legislature for a very long time, but that actually forced the legislators to work together to figure out who's going to be the Speaker of the House, who's going to be the one to assign bills to committee, who's going to figure out, how the entire rules of the session, how they operate. And they were actually able to forge a compromise between the leadership of one party and the leadership of another party. In the end, even though Washington State was a pretty competitive state as far as partisanship goes, you actually had one of the most civil states. It doesn't always work out that way, but in this case, it certainly did. And the same applies to a lesser extent with polarization, that there is a bit of a connection between states where you've got two parties that just ideologically are the exact opposite of one another, but it's not in those states where you've got the highest level of incivility, actually.
What were the top three most uncivil states, and then the top three most civil?
So the top three least civil states are Oklahoma, North Carolina, And the third one should be something like Iowa.
Okay.
The three most civil would be Utah, Oregon, and South Carolina.
Wow, that's really interesting. I never would have guessed Oregon. Oregon had the protest between the lumber truckers and the government, and there was a shutdown on the 5 freeway, I believe, and they're trying to split off and join um, Idaho. So they have had some very extreme protests and angry comments at each other. That's interesting to see that.
Well, yeah, and Oregon was one of the least civil. I'm sorry if I misspoke, but Oregon was one of the least civil. So
Oregon. Okay.
You'd actually expect to see Oregon to have high degrees of incivility. But what makes Oregon and is so interesting, just right across the border, Washington, you got kind of a shared history, shared political culture, the same, similar rural urban divide that you have in Oregon. You also have in Washington. You got the I-5 corridor on both sides of the state that's very urban. On the eastern part of the state is pretty rural. But you don't see that happening in Washington. That doesn't mean Washington's 100% civil all the time, but it does stand in pretty stark contrast to Oregon.
That's exactly what I saw. Very basically the liberals own and dominate the coastal counties, and then 90% of the landmass is rural and is conservative, and they're losing all the elections. But you didn't see the amount of anger in Washington as you saw in Oregon. You just didn't. And yet some of the dynamics were very similar, and they're right next to each other. They're about an hour away. So why do you think you might have incivility in Oregon, but not incivility in Washington?
That's a fantastic question. You're not the first person to ask it. We've been asking ourselves that question for a long time. And a lot of the researchers on the team are either from Oregon or Washington. Like I grew up in Eastern Washington. Nick Loveridge, the lead editor for this book, he's former faculty at Washington State University. Brent Steele is professor at Oregon State University. And Brent actually came up with a really good theory, and there's really no way to test it. But his theory is that even though in Washington you got that rural urban divide, in Washington you still have fairly large population centers on the eastern part of the state. So you got Spokane, you got where I'm from, the Tri-Cities metro area is like 100,000 people. In Oregon, once you get east of the Cascades, there's really nothing. You got Bend, Oregon, which is kind of in the Cascades, and then when you get east of there, there's a few small towns along the interstate that runs through the very northeastern part of Oregon, but not much. And so that probably has something to do with it. And it's not so much even the geography, it's the economics that come along with the geography. If you live in Seattle or Portland, you might work in, the tech sector, you might be some other highly educated worker. But if you live in Eastern Oregon or the rural parts of Eastern Washington, you're probably a farmer, you're probably a rancher. As a result, your economic orientation and your political interests are going to be a little bit different. I think that's. Go ahead.
No, that seems interesting. That between the two, when you go to Washington, there are some cities in the eastern portion. When you go to Oregon, there's not really any sizable city in the eastern portion. And what that means is maybe you can't. In Oregon, you could get everybody on the eastern half because they're all rural to come together. But in Washington, if there's some rural people saying we're mad at those West Coast Washingtonians, they're going to be dealing with urban Washingtonians in their own district, which should reduce the amount of anger they can raise to a palpable level. Again, a theory. I think that makes sense. But why is it bad overall in America? Do we have like 2 states that are in civil, or are we approaching like half? Would you look at the research that you saw and said, this is a largely functional nation? Or would you go, I know that's not a scientific question.
Well, I can tell you this. I can tell you a couple of things. One is, there's no real absolute measure of civility. I mean, the data that we have allows to make state-by-state comparisons, but nobody's ever going to say, anybody who's involved in politics is going to say that everybody involved in politics all the time is always civil, right? And so determining what separates civility from incivility in an absolute sense is pretty much impossible. That said, we do know from subsequent research that the less civil states are less productive, or the less civil state legislatures are less productive. So if you're a state on the naughty list on the lower half of our state rankings, you're going to be less likely to do stuff like pass your budget bill on time. The state, we used like 4 separate measures. We found that more civil states are more likely to pass larger volumes of bills during their state legislative sessions. They're more likely to pass a higher percentage of bills during their legislative sessions. They're more likely to pass bills of some consequence. A lot of state legislatures just pass a lot of bills, right? None of them really affecting our lives. They might be naming a library in some town or something like that. But we do have a data set that lists kind of like important bills. So if you're a civil state, you're more likely to pass a bill on those lists, or a number of bills on that list. And then you're more likely to, again, to pass that budget on time. So it does affect, in some ways, governance. If you're uncivil, there's enough going on, enough bad blood in the state legislature that's preventing people from working together in a way that actually does exactly what the legislature is supposed to do: pass legislation and govern. So I would say it's a worry. And if we see incivility going up, then we're more likely to see more gridlock in state legislatures. And I think this could also explain a lot of what's going on in Congress. To be sure, Congress is a separate beast. It's not a state legislature, but a lot of those same dynamics are going on. And we know that, certainly in recent years, members of Congress haven't been exactly civil to each other all of the time. And as a result, Congress has been less productive. I mean, think about it. When was the last time Congress pieced a really earth-shattering piece of legislation? I ask my students this all the time. What was the last major bill that Congress passed that you can name? And they're political science students. They're pretty aware of things, and they kind of look at me blankly and they'll go, Obamacare. You know when Obamacare was passed? Was it 2010? It's been what, at least 10 years since that bill was passed. And that's the last significant piece of legislation.
Yeah, they had to pass it at midnight too, by the way. So it wasn't exactly like, there you go. Yeah. Like totally sunshiny. It was like they waited to the time when people were asleep and not even there. So meaning that it was tough. That was even tough to get past. I'd go even back further to find something where, 70% of the legislators said, yeah, this is great. Let's do this.
And it's a topic for another whole nother podcast. But the way that Congress works right now, it doesn't work the way that we were taught in high school and college, where there's the I'm just a bill process where you propose a bill, it goes to committee, gets marked. Basically all legislation passed today is passed through special orders, where it's done in a way similar to the way the Obamacare bill was passed, certainly. And people complain about it, but it's the only way to get stuff done these days.
I've noticed. Yeah, they used to have more debates. Now they don't have any debates on anything. They wait till the budget happens, and then they just jam all their bills in the budget and say, "Well, America's going to collapse, or you're going to sign on to this," and then everybody gets all their goodies. So we've eliminated debate, transparency, seeing discussion on what they're going to vote for. It's just a grab bag at Christmas time every year. Seems to be
there's actually a name for it. There's the continuing resolutions that are passed to keep government open funding. And then they've combined those with omnibus bills that do a lot of different things. And so Congress is increasingly passing these cromnibus bills, where they jam a bunch of omnibus bills into a continuing resolution that's kind of like a do or die, pass or fail situation. So yeah, it's kind of a little crazy. We're getting a little off topic.
No, but that's brilliant. I know we only have a few more minutes left. Would you say most of the American state legislatures are civil, looking at this book, or most of them are not, or can't really tell?
Fantastic question. I would say most people go to the state legislature when they get there for the first time. They want to do right. I don't think there's any question about that. Nobody wants to go to a state legislature to tear the place down. There might be a few, actually, but I would say the vast majority are there to do what they think is right. But then, because the political environment that they're operating in is so tainted, because of stuff that's always happening. When they get there, they get a little bit disillusioned, and when push comes to shove, back in the old days, passing legislation's always been stressful. Sometimes you make a deal with somebody and it falls through, or things just don't turn out the way that they turn out, but then they expect them to turn out, but then you always are looking for that next bill. So you have to get along with that person. So even though they double crossed you or they did something you didn't like, you knew that you're going to need their support in the next bill. That seems to have ended. That sort of that we call it the norm of courtesy. Actually, that norm of courtesy has been weakened, because today with social media, there is much more of a political payoff to go on social media and gin up your followers by saying something nasty about the opposition on Twitter, or X as it's now known, than just letting that pass, knowing that the next bill that comes along, you might be able to work with that person that made you so mad. So the calculations have changed, and I think that's causing quite a bit of the incivility now. So I would say most people go there with high hopes, but then they will come to understand the political calculations when things aren't going well, and then that's when everything just kind of falls apart.
I love this book because I was studying polarization at the federal level, and this seemed to be one of the few or only deep dives at the state level. Everybody's talking about the federal level, and this book was focused at the state and not federal. That's one thing I liked about it. Do you have any, you don't have to, but we always ask, do you have any recommendations? Do you know any other professors in political science who might be interested in a discussion on political polarization? You don't have to name anybody, but we always ask.
Well, have you talked to Nick Leverich yet?
I've reached out to him. Yeah, we're still working on it.
Okay, yeah, he would be fantastic. He would be amazing, actually. I saw you already talked to Francis Benjamin. He's fantastic. Let me think about it some more. If any names pop in that focus on polarization, Rob Boatwright, he is, I think, is at Yale. I think. Okay. He studied incivility quite a bit, and also Stephen Steer at Washington State.
I have talked to Stephen Steer,
okay,
but not Rob Boatwright at Yale. And yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, let me write that down real quick.
Don't quote me on the Yale thing. I know he's in the Northeast. I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, I'll find
it. Brown or one of those other nice Ivy schools.
Last question. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person watching this interview, and they say, wow, I learned a lot. Very insightful. I'm struggling to remember it all. But there was this one thing the professor said, and it's 5 days after I finished watching the interview, and I can't get that thought out of my head. What is that one thought you want someone to not be able to forget thinking about 5 days after watching this interview?
Well, I would say that civility matters, that our governing institutions are set up to run a certain way. And they've worked as well as they have for as long as they have because people treated each other with dignity and respect. I think we're starting to lose that. And our book documents it, maybe not across time, but certainly across space. And our subsequent research has shown that it actually matters. So the next time you're on Facebook and somebody says something that you don't like, take a few deep breaths before you respond, because you're not going to solve the problem by acting in an uncivil way, but you might make the problem a little bit better if you respond appropriately. And how you respond appropriately is up to you. But I just would like you to think of that when the time comes.
Would it be good if we sent all American adults back to kindergarten? Because it seems like we've forgotten. Isn't this where we learn? Don't hit. Play nice. Say, just seems like basic
maybe
stuff in school.
I'm the eternal optimist. I think that the way that we behave, certainly online, has improved. I remember 10 years ago when one of my friends from high school would say something on Facebook, and I'd respond right away, and I would think that I was solving the problem. Now, right. I don't think I'm that unique. I think most people are like, I'm just not going to touch that. You just let that person spew their filth and just let it ride, because I'm not going to change anything. I would say that if people are thinking like that, like the way I think they are, I think that's a cause for optimism, actually.
I've actually.
So no, I just public kindergarten. We just have to realize that social media is a toxic environment potentially, and we have to treat it as such.
I've caught myself in the last year doing that, going,
congratulations. Yeah? Welcome to the club.
Oh, I'm making the problem worse, aren't I? Don't just go away. Do something else.
Yeah.
We'll leave it there. Thank you for coming out, Professor. I will send you a copy of the video soon, and I really appreciate your time.
I enjoyed having it. Thanks a lot for having me. Bye-bye.
Okay.